because I love informality.
Well, welcome everyone to the Obligation of Memory podcast. I'm Jeffery Giesener, founder of the Facebook Holocaust Remembrance and Jewish Culture group. And I am thrilled to have my friend, Mark Newhouse, who's a well-known prize-winning author, started in children's books and, believe it or not, is now writing some Holocaust memoirs. So I want to welcome you, Mark, to the Obligations of Memory podcast. And let's start by having you, I know your story a little bit, and then your story is similar to mine, which my parents never talked about the Holocaust. And I know we share that same kind of baseline. So let's talk about that to start with.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. I will tell you that this is probably one of the most difficult things for me to talk about because I feel kind of guilty that I didn't know much about my history. I've heard people speak about how much they know, and I kind of feel that I envy them, which is kind of a strange thing to envy, someone who has experienced such a tragic history. And yet my early life was such a mystery that I knew so very, very little. And it took a long, long time before I could actually learn more. Just to give you a simple example, our family names were almost impossible to learn. My mother, who was a tiny little woman, she had the last name of Izbicki. Now, when I tried finding out who she was, it came up Izbicki, Izbika, Izbitsky, Izbitska, which sounds alike, but there are people who have that name. And so it's very difficult to trace, my history. Mom, I only recently found out, had 7 brothers and sisters. And only recently did I learn their names and some of their story. So as you can see, my entire, early life was basically a mystery. I recently learned, for example, that one of Mom's sisters may have been killed in Warsaw, but there's another story that says she may have been killed in Dachau. And the truth of the matter is, I really don't know where any of my relatives, perished. There are no headstones. There are no tombstones. In a very real sense, I feel very guilty about this and not knowing. And not knowing, I'm not able to pass on this story to my own children and to my own grandchildren. What I have learned so far is that my family, how can I explain this? They are a mystery in many, many ways. My grandfather, his name was Joseph, and my grandmother was named Rachel Wiseman. However, even that is a mystery because sometimes she's called Rivka, other times she was called Rinya, and again, almost impossible to trace. My family, even where they came from, is almost impossible to know. So the question becomes, how did I end up writing a Holocaust book when I knew so little myself?
So let me ask you, before you go there, when you sat down with your parents, they never spoke to you about the Holocaust?
I had a very strange childhood, in all honesty. First of all, I only recently learned that I was born at a displaced persons camp in Germany. And I was born 2 years and 1 day after the liberation of Auschwitz. When we came to this country, my parents...
How did your parents get to the United States? Do you know that story?
Well, I know part of it, okay? What I do know is that my father refused to marry my mother until she conceived. Now, you may say, well, why is that? Well, basically because I was their passport. By having a child, they were able to jump ahead of the line to come to America. One story I received from a relative recently was that they were originally supposed to be on the Exodus going to Israel. And when my mother became pregnant, unfortunately, they had canceled that trip because she became very, very ill.
Stop there for a second. You know, my mother was on that Exodus 1947 ship. And
Well, no, we have a lot in, I
I
know,
know.
Jeffrey, we have a lot in common.
My mother went back to Košice in Czechoslovakia, where she was born. Her father, who survived, along with her two older sisters, all went back to Košice. Unfortunately, she lost her mother in Auschwitz, and he remarried. And my mother didn't get along with his new wife for lots of reasons. I think because her mother was beloved in stories that I heard growing up. And then Mom decided to go to Palestine in 1947, went on Exodus 1947, and was turned back in Palestine by the British. And she was in a DP camp in Cyprus for over a year. So she went from Auschwitz back to Košice to a DP camp in Cyprus. And I know none of this. So we're going to talk a little bit about our shared memories, but go ahead. You were talking about your being a child. You went ahead of the line.
Well, yeah, my brother says I was the passport for them to come to America. And they were sponsored by Hayas. Now, Hayas, which was the Hebrew, I forget what it was called. They helped Jews escaping from Europe. But what a lot of people don't know is this was a loan. It was not a gift. And so when my father came to this country, he had to work basically 24 hours a day to repay that loan. And his first job was working as a assistant on a truck, delivering baby carriages. Shortly after that, he ended up working on a truck as a ragman. Just like Kirk Douglas's father was. And eventually my father opened up his own business, but he never really had time, to talk to us. He was not the kind of person you would talk to.
Lay out your siblings. You have how many siblings?
Well, that's interesting too. I have one brother who is about 22 months younger than I am, and he was born in America. He was born in the Bronx. I also have two half-brothers who are about 35 years younger than I am.
Really?
And that's another story. My father married someone who was about 35 years younger than he was. My parents stayed together for about 20 years in a terrible marriage. I think that's one of the reasons why they never really told us much. And, it was funny because their friends were mostly what they call greener, immigrants from Poland and Russia, and some from Germany. And I remember we would be sitting in the living room, or they'd be sitting in the living room. My brother and I were really not allowed in the living room, on plastic covered couches. You remember those?
Yeah.
And they would be sitting there, and they would be speaking in Polish and Yiddish and some Russian and some German. What they didn't know was that I understood and picked up a lot of what they were talking about. My mother finally found that out when she told someone on the phone that I should sedreda mi kop, which means screw my head around. And I said, what do you mean screw my head around? And that gave up the whole gig. But yeah,
where did your parents come from? Poland, or where did you know do you know where they came from?
Well, that's another issue. My father's, when we went to the Holocaust Museum, and when we went to the Holocaust Museum, I had the good fortune of meeting the head researcher. And he tried tracing my father's history. And what he found out was that my father had changed his name a number of times, and he had changed his age. And so it was almost impossible to trace where he was and how he survived. We do know that they lived in Lodz proper, and Lodz was an industrial city in Poland. And then in 1939, the Poles and the Germans chased the Jews that lived in Lodz, that had manufacturing in Lodz, and they chased them into the Lodz ghetto, which was really a horrible slum, almost completely insulated from the rest of the world. And to show you how little I knew, I thought it was like Anna Tefka and Fiddler on the Roof. I really had no understanding that it was set up by the Nazis as a holding tank for Jews. And afterwards, they were going to be sent to a destination unknown to them. And when I found out, I was so shocked that that's really what inspired my writing this book.
When did you find this? When you say you found out, when was this?
Well, it actually happened by accident. My mother, shortly before she died, gave me a book, and it was huge. It was a monster of a book. And I put it aside. And one day my wife said to me, Mark, you have got to get rid of some of your books. So I pulled out all my books from my cabinets, and I was sitting on the floor, and I had this book in the thrift store pile. And suddenly it opened, and I saw that it was signed to my mother and to my stepfather, who was also, by the way, a Holocaust survivor and a wonderful, wonderful man. I turned the book over to see the cover, and I was shocked. It was a chronicle of the Lodz ghetto. I sat there.
You have the title?
Yes, it's called The Chronicle of the Lodz Ghetto.
Okay.
It's by Lukjan Dobrzycki, and it was published by Yale University Press in 1984. I was so shocked that I sat on the floor reading and learning for the first time what it was like in the ghetto. Incredibly, I had never thought that this was going to be a story that would capture my imagination and drag me back through hell, because that's what the Lodz ghetto really was. It was a life in hell. Many people know about the Warsaw ghetto, but they don't know about the Lodz ghetto.
So, Mark, we're getting close to our first half hour together, and we're going to literally pause here, and we're going to our second episode. But I want to recap for our audience what I heard. Okay, so you had your mother and your father who was coming to the United States from Poland. They didn't get along, so at some point they divorced, that sounded like, and they both remarried. Is that right?
That's correct.
Right. And you have a stepfather and a stepmother, and you have three siblings, two from your original parents, and then you have two additional siblings from your father's marriage, his second marriage. Is that right?
That's correct.
That is a great place for us to pick up our second part of our episode of interviews. We're on the Obligation of Memory podcast for the Jewish Culture and Holocaust Remembrance Group on Facebook and YouTube. I'm speaking to the terrific author, Mark Newhouse, who has an amazing story to tell. And we're going to start up again with episode number 2 in a short bit of time. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you again on the other side.